In this next video, we're going to break down a part of the brain that is oftentimes unfamiliar to folks. It's called the midbrain. If you remember when I showed the picture of the developing brain, that the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain were about the same size early on. Over time, though, the hindbrain develops these additional structures like the pons and the cerebellum, whereas the forebrain, in humans at least, expands quite a bit to form this whole structure of the cerebrum, including this cap on the top of the brainstem. The midbrain, however, kind of hangs out here, becoming eventually relatively small compared to the other parts. That said, within the midbrain, there are a number of important structures. We're going to go through some of those structures and what they do for your psychology. So, on the back or posterior side of the midbrain is sometimes referred to as the tectum. Though I'm not particularly interested in you learning that term. It's kind of an old way of thinking about this. Within the tectum are two structures called the colliculi, okay, or sets of structures called colliculi. Colliculus is the singular. Some of these are superior and some are inferior, which means superior is on top and inferior is on the bottom within the midbrain. These structures you can see in the picture here are actually bumps off of the posterior side of the midbrain. That's how you can identify them. The colliculi have an important role in what you might think of as kind of instinctual or fairly automatic sensory coordination. Whereas the superior colliculi work with visual senses. The inferior colliculi work with auditory senses, but they kind of have similar roles in terms of taking visual or auditory information and starting a response, relaying a response in a way that doesn't necessarily even require conscious perception yet. So what do I mean by that? So for the superior colliculi, for example, visual information can come in and get relayed through the superior colliculi in your midbrain that will then direct movement of your head. Okay, partly through other structures that are going to be connected to it, right? But if you see something moving in the corner of your eye, you may notice that your head moves or is directed to it. Even your eyes are directed to it, even, right? Um, Even before you necessarily know what it is or even know that you've seen something. So starting that process of almost instinctually responding to visual stimuli like that is a role for the superior colliculi. This can also help us to, close our eyes if something's coming at us, or blink when we need to. The superior colliculi can set off some of those sort of quick responses like that. The inferior colliculi can do some of the same things for auditory information. So if you hear something, or if you're an animal out in the wild and you hear a noise, you can almost immediately start either moving away from that or turning toward it so that you can appraise what it might be even before you've necessarily perceived it fully. So you'll see this is, again, a kind of really basic kind of functioning of sensation. It's really just almost getting your attention or responding almost immediately, or having some immediate survival related response. Is the main function of these areas. Of course, they'll get involved in other ways too, but this is kind of oftentimes thought of what they mostly are for us. Beyond the colliculi in the posterior, the anterior or main part of the midbrain is sometimes referred to as the tegmentum. That's going to include a number of structures that are important for us psychologically. So first, some of the reticular formation actually follows in through the midbrain. We've already talked about the reticular formation, which is involved in your activating system and basic attention, arousal, that sort of thing. A couple other structures you should know. There's two structures called the red nucleus and the substantia nigra that have similar functions. They're both involved in sensory motor issues. So, as a note, your sensory neurons and your motor neurons, your afferent and efferent neurons out to your peripheral nervous system separate in the spinal cord. So you've got, a row of sensory neurons, and you've got a row of motor neurons running up and down your spinal cord, and they're separated from each other, which is why, sometimes you can get damage to your spinal cord that causes sensory issues, and sometimes it causes motor issues, but not always both. Well, your sensory and your motor neurons need some connections in the brain, right? Because if I touch something with my hand that I'm picking up, I need to be able to coordinate my sense of touch with my movements so that I can coordinate my fine motor skills, right? So as I move a pencil while I write, I'm using my motor neurons to move my fingers, but I'm also feeling the pencil move. Coordinating that is really necessary for me to write effectively. I need both. And so the red nucleus and the substantia nigra are going to be one of the first places where those get back together, either in terms of the sensory signals coordinated with motor signals on the afferent or efferent directions. Okay, so that's going to be one of the first places where those coordinate. Again, you'll see this is really kind of really important for basic functioning, right? I don't just need to sense things or just need to move things. I need to coordinate them at some point. And so one of these basic structures in the midbrain, in the brainstem, is going to be important for starting that connection. The periaqueductal gray is the last part of the midbrain that you should know. This is really important in reducing pain. So as those sensory neurons, those sensory neurons are coming up through the spinal cord and then getting to the midbrain fairly quickly. So sensory neurons are sending signals from your skin or the rest of your body. Some of those signals are going to include very strong pain sensations that we don't necessarily want to perceive as painfully as they could be, right? And so before those sensations get to the rest of your brain to consciously perceive how painful they are, the periaqueductal gray is going to be hanging out en route, right? And so neurons in the periaqueductal gray can allow the transfer of opiates, which can reduce pain sensations and pain perception later on. Of course, this is important for psychology, and we'll talk about this later in the chapter on drugs and addiction, right? Because we have natural opiates that allow us to reduce pain, and of course, we've developed opiates over time that people take as either legal or illegal drugs to reduce pain and for other reasons. That's a lot of that is going to get me through this periaqueductal gray. Now, the reason we call these the names that they do is essentially just because of what they look like. Okay, so you've got the red nucleus is literally red in color, the substantia nigra is black in color, and the periaqueductal gray is right around the central, the cerebral aqueduct. Sorry, this aqueduct here, the central canal here as we connect. So you don't necessarily need to be able to find these in a picture for this class, but knowing sort of where they are and what they look like might help you to remember the names. And that's it for the midbrain. Not too much going on here, but some new structures that might be unfamiliar.